I'm Ted Parson. I'm a professor here at UCLA Law School, where, among my other jobs, I direct the AI Pulse project, which examines the legal and policy implications of AI and related technologies. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's web conversation, which is sponsored by the AI Pulse project and the University of Arizona's TechLaw program. Our topic today is alternative payment and business models for the internet. Is the presently dominant advertising model fundamentally flawed or doomed? And if so, what alternative approaches are most promising? And in particular, does the model of small, whether you call them mini, micro, or nano payments for small transactions, have promise despite the number of criticisms that have been advanced against it and the disappointing experience of several early attempts to roll it out? Our starting point for this conversation is a couple of essays by David Brin, which we circulated along with the invitation, and David's going to start us off today. David is an astrophysicist and a renowned science fiction author, as well as an award-winning author of a nonfiction book on the information age, The Transparent Society. So in David's two essays, he answers our two questions, yes and yes, but with some important wrinkles and differences from past efforts. Now, in conversation with David, we're fortunate to have three remarkably creative thinkers who also happen all to be law professors. Jane Bambauer is a professor at the University of Arizona, where she studies the social impacts of big data and the impact of privacy laws. Mark Lemley is a professor at Stanford Law, where he directs Stanford's program in law, science, and technology. And my colleague Eugene Volokh, professor at UCLA Law and well-known blogger on legal issues. A couple of very brief housekeeping notes before we launch. Our total time here is just 60 minutes. David is going to lead us off with some opening remarks of 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll move to a conversation among the panelists to a total of about 20 or 25 minutes, and then continue through the remainder of the hour with the discussion with input from attendees' questions. If you're attending and you want to submit a question, please use the Zoom question and answer screen, not the chat, not the hand raise function. I will serve up questions to the speakers and keep us on time, including ending us sharp at 3 o'clock as planned. That's all I have to say, and so now let's get started. May I turn it over to David, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Excellently done, and I'm honored to be in the company of such distinguished seers and sages on this civilization and its dedication to law and not capricious whim by any kind of ruling class. Of course, the internet was projected to be one of the great liberators, and it is in many ways and probably will be. But we need to look back across history and realize that every generation in Western civilization has had crises caused by new communication abilities. The printing press expanded what we can know so that we would have information outside our head. Literacy did that, but only for a small clerk class up until that point. And the eyeglasses, glass lenses expanded what we can see, and perspective expanded what we can pay attention to. And since then, there have been expansions of vision and knowledge and perspective, attention, that have overwhelmed what came before. And always pessimists said human beings can't deal with that. And optimists said this is going to expand what it means to be human. And both were always right in that order. Always the new technology messed things up badly at first. The printing press was absolutely horrible influence on the religious wars of Europe. Radios and loudspeakers virtually destroyed human civilization in the 30s and 40s. The only exception is television, which arguably did far more good than harm. And we could talk about that separately. Now, the internet is driven by this desire to have all this wonderful good stuff and floundering around for how to eliminate the problems of anonymity without getting rid of the advantages of anonymity. And that's a whole nother topic that we can talk about another time. But one of the pernicious influences has been that the internet has largely been paid for by advertising, which has had many influences. First of all, it's robbed traditional news media of their major funding source. So news has fallen into really serious trouble. Second, it has naturally follows a Marxist pattern of this capitalist activity getting narrower and narrower and narrower in its consolidation into a few narrow companies and groups that rake in everything, and all the others players are crushed. But there's a more fundamental reason, and it's pernicious on its influences on what is contained in the internet. But and it's unpleasant for all of us. We all do what we can to avoid the advertising. And of course, the targeting of us to try to sell us specific things has been a real problem because it implies that the gathering of our information follows an Orwellian path, though arguably not as harmful as in 1984 because they're just trying to sell us stuff for now. The fundamental reason why this can't maintain reasons have been given by many people. Like, for instance, the amount of money is insufficient to maintain all the participants. And advertising is being evaded better and better. But the main reason why it won't continue is this. The aggregators are getting better and better at using our information to target ads at us. You know that. If you just searched for something without it even trying to buy anything, that thing will start showing up on your ad feed in Facebook and other places. They predict what you're going to want with uncanny accuracy, but here's the deal. As these algorithms get better and better and more compact, they are going to be fittable on your own devices, your Alexa or your phone. And when that happens, that some assistant of yours, AI assistant of yours, can parse and know and predict what it is that you're going to want, as well as Google and YouTube do when they advertise to you, then what you've got is a shopping assistant. And you have absolutely no need for it to be obnoxiously push from Google and I said Gabble, and Amazon and all these things. As a matter of fact, your irritation with that level will go up vastly. So when you have a shopping assistant that can follow your parameters to say, do you want to see this? Do you want to see that? There is no basis for the advertising model to continue. In any event, for all of those reasons, can there be an alternative? The principal alternative that has been discussed over the years has been to just let people pay. Now, people pay for tangible goods through eBay and PayPal. They pay for things. They pay for tangible things and they get them. And this has worked very well. But for the smaller intangible purchases, like for instance, getting to read a New York Times article, they have tried silos. You can't read this article unless you sign in to your paid silo and pay a subscription. The biggest reason why people don't want to do those silos is not the amount of money. They'd be willing to pay $10 a year. They'd be willing to pay a nickel per article. But there are so many silos that they'd rather pay a nickel per article than join all these silos. The biggest reason they don't want to get involved in any of that, and they surf onward and they find alternatives and aggregators, is because they don't want to interrupt the surfing experience. If it's one click, they would be willing to pay a nickel or a quarter or a dime to read a New York Times article that they read the first paragraph and it's somewhat interesting. This has been attempted at least 24 times, micropayments, and it's always failed because they have followed the wrong models. And if you'd like, we can talk about why this failure has happened again and again and again. And they're trying to go for a system that's similar to PayPal when it is absolutely the opposite in every way. And the secret sauce for making micropayments work, at least as I assert in those two articles on Evonomics. Evonomics, by the way, is a wonderful site in which Adam Smith comes alive and proved that today he'd be a flaming liberal. The Evonomics, on Evonomics, my papers discussed one fundamental, and that is that micropayment systems can be made much easier using a different approach that would retain the one-click capability that people want when they're surfing. And they would then be willing to press a nickel button, press a dime button, press a quarter button. And we can talk about that, but I have blabbed and blabbed and blabbed too long. So
okay, and you've left us on the very edge of desperately wanting more, because you've said there's one piece of the secret sauce that's missing and you haven't shared it, but what a great point to turn it over to a conversation among our other speakers. So to the extent that you folks are comfortable with just doing so, I'll stay out of the way as moderator. I'll, at a certain point, I'll start coming with questions and so on, but off you go.
So David, you don't want to tell us the secret sauce yet?
Of course I do. It's just, I do enough blabbing online and at science fiction conventions and at the CIA, for heaven's sake. This is the first year in 5 I haven't been there.
He wants you to ask for it.
That one, a gentleman waits to be asked.
I mean, or we can also jump in to talk about the premise for a little bit before you reveal.
Great.
Mark, you're muted.
Let's do that, right? I mean, because I think the premise is an important one, right? But you might start with the sort of, I don't know, received fact that people have been saying for a long time advertising will die, and it hasn't, right? And I wouldn't, if you'd asked me sort of 10 years ago, right, would Google's advertising revenues continue to be rising quarter after quarter, I would have said, of course not. That's ridiculous, right? The market can't sustain that much. Now, that doesn't mean I think that that David's wrong, right? Either that we do reach a logical stopping point at some point, or that the ability to sort of personalize and control our own data information may preempt this. But it is, it is interesting to me, or not just that micropayment systems have failed, but that advertising has so far been so successful on the internet.
Well, who pays attention to these ads? I mean, I like to think I'm really good at ignoring them. Maybe I'm not, but I'm shocked that they seem as effective as they are. Because you'd think that people would be so annoyed by them that they just look at the stuff and do a good job of it.
But here, I do think the targeting makes a difference, right?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the one thing that the internet brought as an advertising innovation model that all previous advertising didn't have is the ability to modulate that ad to you and to specific things you are interested in. So the answer is, I like to ignore most ads on the internet, but I also buy stuff off Facebook all the time because they've got my number. They know exactly the geeky T-shirt that I'm going to want. Because they've paid enough attention to me. And that's something that no television channel is ever going to have.
Jane, you had something?
Well, I think all of those observations are right. And also I object, I guess, to the assumption, which is broadly shared, but I just still think is wrong, that the advertising, and especially targeted advertising, is pernicious. So first of all, just in terms of understanding the economics and how important it is for the content creators, it clearly is important because, the revenue that they bring in from being able to offer tailored advertising is like, something like 60% higher than with just contextual advertising alone. But also from the consumer side, consumers, I think there are descriptive accounts that are varied here, but at least some studies seem to suggest that people are not increasingly annoyed, that in fact they're decreasingly annoyed at advertising for roughly the same reasons that their personal shopper idea would be likely to take off. But the personal shopper idea, unless people really understand what types of information are relevant for getting to the right product and for learning about products that they don't even know about, even the personal shopper may not be able to outperform Google.
Well, I think that the personal shopper, when it comes along, will be there will be services that will help to questionnaire you so that your algorithm, your Alexa algorithm, will work properly and possibly avoid some of your addictions. But we're all aware of dark Hollywood warnings about where push advertising that's highly tailored could lead. We all recall that scene from Minority Report in which Tom Cruise has replaced his eyeballs, and by reading his irises, the holograms are leaping out at him. Mr. Yakamoto, have you tried the new Tesla? Which is, of course, an anachronism. The point is that we're already tuned to worry about accumulations. I have an essay about this, if you put in my name, and the idiot plot. I explain why Hollywood goes after these failure mode scenarios, and it's actually been fairly wholesome in many ways. But of course, I have agreed with you many times, Jane, that when people get overly paranoid about Google and these others aggregating your information in the near term, they want to sell you something? This is not Orwell. It can become Orwell, which is why moving as much away from push, which is what we saw in the Minority Report, into a form of autonomous pull that's on your Alexa, and that's your autonomous decision to tailor your algorithms the way you want them. That is a trend that I talked about in the Transparent Society, that is to use... Advertising. Yeah, well, everybody is pre-selected to be interested.
Right.
Sorry.
Very worthwhile advertising, I should add.
Yes.
I didn't see it. My ad blocker put a blank space of David's screen.
All right. So in any event, the point is that I believe the thing that's going to drive the transformation over to micropayments is a multiple set of things. One is, if it increases the fluidity and power of the internet surfer to get what she or he wants with a click, I think that that itself is going to be the attraction that overcomes the cost of a nickel or a dime or a quarter. Once a fair number of people are doing that, then you're going to have a monetary incentive for places like the New York Times or an aggregator that they control with other news media to put their thumbs on the scale in favor of direct payment rather than advertising. Because
I just wanted to establish that I love your idea, and because I don't hate advertising, it means that there are reasons to pursue this, irrespective of whether people buy into your premise about how bad and potentially dangerous tracking is going to be. So
well, and so let me take a slightly different cut at that, right? Because as someone who lived through the transition from broadcast television to cable television, we were promised, here is this thing that has always been free, and guess what, you're going to pay for it. Well, that doesn't sound like a great deal. What's the trade-off? The trade-off that was promised was you're going to pay for it via cable, but you won't have to look at ads anymore. And we all bought in and we all got cable, and sure enough, we got pay every month and look at ads. Right? Because it turns out, if there's two revenue streams, why not use both of them? So I guess one of the things that I worry about, maybe Jane doesn't worry about it as much, but I worry about is, yeah, we'll create a micropayments infrastructure, but gosh, there's that space there, and we can make extra revenue if we filled it up with ads. And maybe the answer is content creators get more money, and if you're a content creator, great. But I worry that consumers might end up sort of not getting what they might think of as the benefit of the bargain.
Wow.
But they do have ad blockers.
Science fictional sort of a guy there, Mark. You look beyond the problem, the solution, to the problem that might evolve from the solution. And I think that's a terribly important, because I do that in my novels, my near future novels like Existence and Earth. I very often point out, be careful what you wish for, because you may get this very thing, and it may have these interesting consequences. But in any event, I believe that offering people the option of a micropayment system that improves their surfing ability, if not for no other reason than if an article interests them, that a lot of people will grumble that the New York Times article that's interesting only shows the first 2 paragraphs. You have to sign in order to get the rest. So they actually go 3 or 4 clicks to a side view aggregator in order to get around it. And mea culpa, I have done that. If you are offering something that simply for a nickel allows them to bypass that cheat, and that nickel goes to the New York Times, I think you're talking about a win-win that at least would have some short-term sign-in. Now, I met some of these people. There's a group in Holland, for instance, that tried one of the latest attempts at micropayments, and it all wound up being a security system similar to PayPal and with essentially silos. In other words, if you try to do micropayments, people are going to say, oh, it never worked. Nobody's going to want to pay for anything. It's not the not willing to pay for anything. It is the rigmarole. And all of them have felt we need to set up a security system similar to PayPal that includes signing in. And that's the calamity. And the secret sauce is to say, no, PayPal, you sign in and you're secure because you are dealing with tangible amounts, even if it's just $5. And it is for items that are in some way tangible that the person selling it to you doesn't want to lose them. Neither party wants this transaction to hack, and they are worried that it might be. So you have sign-ins and you have passwords.
In just a moment, I'm going to move on to start teeing up some of the fabulous questions that are coming up from other attendees. But before we do that, and before we move completely off denouncing the ad model to examining the details of David's alternative, I want to point out, David, there's a couple of really provocative teasers near the start of your first piece where you identify 4 fundamental problems, social impacts of the internet. The 4th one is it's filled with advertising and people hate it. And then you say, I'm going to talk about that one because it's powerfully implicated in the first 3. Now, we've talked about there's not enough money to sustain businesses, and we've talked about consumers hate it, but I don't think I've heard you explicitly talk about how the ad model has contributed to polarization and fragmentation of society, the elevation of sort of violent and extreme discourse, the concentration of political power. If you want to, in 3 sentences, say, how's it responsible for those things too? I think that might be helpful and maybe strengthen the case against some of the skepticism you're getting from our other panelists that it's really fundamentally flawed.
Well, I
note how Ted once again just sort of put the solution off. We were just about to get to the solution.
Yeah. I know, and we're going to get there.
Nice narrative move.
Right.
Let me answer, Ted.
I need to know.
You guys know.
Yeah.
Stay on the edge of your seats. Yeah.
In that a fair amount of the lurid sensationalism on the web today is to attract clickbait, to get a lot more people looking so that your advertising revenues go up. I think there is definitely a driver for the lurid in that the advertising helps to drive. I mean, people. Take a look, for instance, and this wasn't even a phenomenon when I wrote the first of these articles. Influencers, sorry about that. Influencers. I mean, good Lord. I mean, if nothing else, the bad aspect of that is just the lobotomization toward idiocracy. But it wasn't on my list because that sounds like a crotchety old fart.
I do think you're right about the clickbait problem, though. I used to write newspaper headlines for a living, and I'm horrified, right? Because it's almost always the case that the newspaper headline has somewhere between 50% and nothing to do with the actual content of the story.
Well, the greatest example of that is the only news of the day is that there's a fire going on in the city dump. And seagulls are upset about it. And the headline is, thousands flee foul blades.
So I take it the argument would be that there wouldn't be as much micropayment bait, because if people are drawn in and then have to pay, they'd be less willing to pay if they see that they've been drawn into junk, whereas their eyeballs still count for ad impressions. Even
And you just segued directly into, unless Ted
Before
stops
we
us.
do,
Yeah, Jane.
Unless
Jane.
Ted stops us. All right, it's Jane.
this whole event was clickbait. We don't actually have a
yeah, that's it. No secret sauce at all. We just with our secret advertising. You're not seeing it, but deep down inside there is.
I agree with Mark when it comes to advertising in general, but I don't agree on the distinction between contextual and targeted advertising. In fact, the lessons from Europe suggest the opposite, that if you're an advertiser and you're trying to figure out which types of eyeballs you're getting, you're actually more interested in clickbaity, maybe clickbait isn't quite the right distinction here, but you're more interested in the kinds of content where by the nature of the content, they're segmenting people more. So for example, travel or narrow political websites get a different, more interest in advertisers than a general website that's more likely to attract more people.
Yes, Jane. And I think that correlates with one of my complaints, and that is that people are less, this encourages Nuremberg rallies. These that I talked about in my 1990 novel, Earth, predicting that the web would result in millions of people habituating and occupying web spaces that only reinforce their narrow view of the world. And alas, that has come true. Are we ready?
For the sauce, yes.
Yes. Okay. So what you both have been leading into is that the security system that destroyed all previous micropayment systems for two reasons. A, it's extremely expensive to start off with a security system that's really tight. And secondly, because it will reduce the surfing ability of users, and there's exactly what you don't want to have to sign in. The answer is you remove security issue to a different category, and that is the New York Times, its website, it shows those first two paragraphs. You have an option to sign into the silo or press a nickel button. The nickel button will send a signal to your micropayment system to send a nickel to the New York Times. That signal at the same time opens up the article. There's no sign-in whatsoever. So how do you have any security? How do you prevent being hacked? How do you prevent being robbed? The simple answer is called disavowal. At the end of a week, a day, a month, you get, according to your own parameters, you get a list of all the micropayments that you've made. You may disavow any of them. That's your security. During the first year that you're a member, you can disavow anything free. The second year you're a member, you get 100 free disavowals a month. But it doesn't matter what the boundaries are. It doesn't matter what they are. You get the idea that if the user is responsible for saying, I'm not going to pay that nickel because A, I don't think I did that click. Somebody hacked me, or for a nickel. Or B, because that was crap. if that's the case, then that sends signals to the system saying, okay, we're going to set an algorithm to work finding out if this was hacked. And then send this person a warning saying, we don't think you were hacked. Or here's another aspect of the secret sauce. I didn't like that signals. Going to the New York Times or going to the National Enquirer is data. It's actually interesting data. And micropayments can flow both ways, by the way. If you are providing data along the way to these content providers, there is reason to believe that in the general play of the market, you might get a penny for your data. And this is the dream that Jaron Lanier talked about 15 years ago that still has not happened. But it ought to, there ought to at least be the possibility that these content providers, that you're clicking the nickel button, that there's a possible that it might be going two ways because you are providing information. And this may be the method to finally provide what Jaron Lanier said logically ought to be the case. And that is, we all should be paid for information that is of value to these aggregators and these sources. So I don't know that I made disavowal clear. I tried my best. But the main point is that you can set up a micropayment system and spend very, very little on security while the system develops customers. And the first couple of years, the New York Times, it's going to be just found money. They're not going to complain about a bunch of disavowals. After 3 or 4 years, they're going to rely on this as an income source. They're going to start complaining about all the disavowals. By that point, your system is rolling along. You can figure out something to any of the people listening to this could come up with things that they might do about the disavowal system to start making it a little tighter.
So let me ask about one of the.
I'm sorry, Mark. Please ask, and then Jane, if you have something, and then I think it's time for the Q&A.
I was going to say, ask you to respond to sort of the sort of one obvious objection from the site owner's side is going to be, wait a minute, if you can just disavow because you didn't like something, aren't people going to game the system? You're going to go around reading all the stuff you want. You're going to say you're going to pay money, and then you just turn it all down. Absolutely.
And the reason why you have almost universal disavowal, I don't care if it's the first month or the first year, that's up to the people who are implementing this thing to try to thrash out and work out. But the reason why you have it free disavowal in the opening period is to attract people to the system. And New York Times would understand that. They have, you know, all your cable companies and your Disney Plus, they all have free 1 month with free 2 months come-ons. The point is that once you start having this disavowal system and you get past the first period, and some people are trying to be free riders more than other people, what you do is you start implementing some degree of credibility. And you start saying, hey, look, you know, you've said these were hacked and you didn't do them. All our systems show that it was you. Would you answer this questionnaire so that we can figure out if it really was you? And if it was you, you know, you're just going to have to go away if you keep doing this. This can be handled in a fluid way along some sliding scale over a time period. The content providers are going to be very patient with this, because let's remember this: the marginal cost to them of the product that they're selling, that some freeloaders are stealing, is zero. Now, it's true that there's comparative opportunity cost versus trying to get people into your silo or paying other ways. But that's just not going to be involved in their minds the first couple of years. This is going to be found money.
Now, there's a bunch of great questions that are coming in. Some of them are going back to the criticisms that we were discussing earlier about the ad model, and I think we've moved on, and so it's worth focusing more on this and other proposed solutions. Several of them are proposing alternative models as alternative solutions, but some of them are critiquing precisely the micropayments and disavowal proposal. So I'm going to tee up one or two of those first. A couple of people have expressed skepticism that a move to micropayments with disavowal would actually change the incentives related to quality information production, would in effect diminish incentives for extreme provocative clickbaity, bad journalism relative to the present model. Would it really do that, or would revenue streams that get big from a huge number of tiny transactions in that form still have the same perverse incentives?
I think that is an absolutely excellent question. The number one reason is because the micropayments with disavowal is going to primarily go to those who currently have silos. That's going to be the first bunch of people. Now, who are these people? These are not the clickbaity, I'm going to do something lurid to get you in so that my ad numbers go up and I get more ads. This is not going to be the Nuremberg rallies. The first people who are going to put a nickel button or a dime button or a quarter button 2 paragraphs down are going to be content providers who currently have silos. And those silos are driving people away, not because of the money, but because of the inconvenience. And that's the main thing about the secret sauce. So I think it's an excellent question. I think it's an excellent concern, but I think the answer to it is that most of the places that will charge a nickel are going to be places that are attractive because they have real content.
Yeah. In order to avoid the structure of this turning into questioners pick on David and try to pick holes in his proposal and he defends himself, I want to say— I
don't mind.
Yeah, but do any of the rest of you have thoughts on this broad issue, the incentive effects of the alternative model in terms of quality production?
So I think that the model is going to promote quality production with quality defined as satisfaction to readers. So I think some people, for example, right now who put up their stuff for free are going to put on this little button because what's the downside? And they're going to find that that's actually a good way of raising money from people who really like what they're doing. And if you think those people are, you label them extremists, however you define it, it may be a great way for kind of, let's put it more neutrally, somebody who has an audience of people who are ideologically committed and likely to say yeah to what they're saying and therefore be willing to support it. So
no, go ahead, please finish.
I'm not sure that's wrong. In fact, I think, if that means that gun rights supporters and abortion rights supporters and supporters of some particular candidates end up getting more revenue this way, I don't think there's anything bad. But I do think that it isn't necessarily going to promote stuff that's quality to the outsiders, that we think, oh yes, this is great reasoning. It's going to promote things that people are willing to pay for, some of which will be good, some of which will be bad. The one thing that'll unite it is it'll be good from the perspective of the payer.
Jen and Mark, you're both looking skeptical.
I just wanted to say one thing related to that, and that's an aspect of disavowal that is psychologically extremely important. And that is overcoming buyer's regret. That's not the right term, is it? What is it called?
Remorse, yeah.
Buyer's remorse. Yeah.
Buyer's remorse, right.
Exactly.
And that actually it costs a toll on people surfing on the internet. The nickel's worth, if you're paying a nickel, there is a small fear, a microscopic nano fear that you're paying this for nothing. Disavowal, while still providing data, buyer disavowal to the content provider, eliminates buyer's remorse. And I have seen studies, I cannot cite them right now, that indicate that this kind of thing, if it happens a lot over the course of an evening or a day or a Saturday, can really add up on people. Just as the highs that they get from clicking on things that agree with them can add up. You guys had something you want to
I
Yeah, Mark.
I feel buyer's remorse after reading free articles for free, so I am totally willing to subscribe.
Because there's no way you can disavow your time, Mark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I
Give you a refund of your time.
I do think one of the things that makes this work, if the ecosystem works, is that it is at least a little hard and annoying to disavow, right? And, you know, if I didn't spend that much money and I'm a busy person, maybe I'm just going to kind of scroll through the list, but I'm not going to pay that much attention. Or I'll look at the bottom line number and I'll say, well, that doesn't seem crazy to me, fine. You know, if something annoyed me and I want to make sure, man, I never want these people to get my money, I guess I might go in and delete it. So disavowal works on this story, as I understand it, in part because it's at least a little bit hard, right?
Yeah. I think that and each disavowal is trackable in some way. So the intermediary that's got your credit card number and handles all the paperwork and handles the payments, they get data from each disavowal. And they pass on the disavowals that are specific to the New York Times to the New York Times. This is actually data that's of sort of real value. So you get your nickel back, but they get information. And
they may even have to pay you more than your nickel, because that information is so high value.
Exactly. It can cause the tide to go the other way by a penny or two. Or the intermediary is getting a different kind of value, and that is value about what a freeloader you are.
Yeah. Jane, you still look like you're sitting on an objection, and we want to hear it.
Well, we kind of moved on from the initial question about whether this actually solves the kind of splinternet problem, but I'm okay with that because I don't think that this has to solve every problem. But I'm less worried about disavowal fraud from the individual users who are paying toward content providers. I'm a little more worried about the payments that come to users based on tracking, because I think there's something, just thinking about kind of the typical morality, or the moral sort of guideposts of a typical internet user. I think they're not likely to pretend that they didn't read and enjoy a piece that they actually did, but they are, at least right now, really annoyed at data tracking, irrespective of the indirect benefits that that they may get from it in terms of funding content. And so I could imagine some fraud or protests, and just in the form of insisting from a bunch of sites that they pay for all the tracking that they're doing.
Well, I think that it's terribly important that privacy be protected in the things that you don't disavow. So there's no reason for anybody to know any of that stuff. But if you disavow, there's a legitimate reason for your intermediary payment company to at least know that what your ratio of disavowals, and whether or not they tell the New York Times that this has happened. Well, you know what? That can be part of your preferences parameters.
Well, so that's still with the money going from the users to the content providers, and I'm talking about the money going the other way. So you get to track me, and now I get a penny. Right?
Well,
so
yeah, but your preferences supposedly. This is great stuff for the meeting of the people who are planning how to outline the design for this thing, because
it sounds like disavowal only goes in one direction.
I believe that the preferences that you set can set privacy preferences, providing that the intermediary who's handling the money gets to track at least that one piece of information as to whether or not you're a freeloader. So, otherwise, I see no reason why it shouldn't be a matter of preferences.
There's another theme that's emerging in a couple of questions here, which is skepticism about whether a micropayment system, even with disavowal, would actually overcome the barrier that you've identified, the sort of cognitive burden of the transaction and so on. So doesn't a requirement for kind of an affirmative opt-in, even at a microtransaction level, and then particularly getting your monthly report from your intermediary with your 600 transactions and having to go through and click on them, That sounds kind of dreary and burdensome to me in terms of cognitive burden. So,
well, I think Mark answered that. By the way, that's also an excellent question. I think Mark answered the latter.
Whoever said those two, so bask in the good
right.
feeling of this affirmation.
Mark was right. Is right. Eugene, you are muted.
Mark, I was just saying we'll eventually send them a micropayment for their questions.
But Mark is right that most people, if they see that they only spent $7 this month on nickel transactions, are just going to shrug it off.
Or you could cap it, right? You could have a sort of like,
you can set a cap, and that's a great way of having the bartender cut you off.
Right,
or take your keys.
Right.
And there are people for whom that is entirely apropos.
So can I raise
the other aspect of the buyer's remorse for a nickel is the world's smallest violin playing hearts and flowers. Yeah, you don't have to join this. Most people will actually feel a sense of empowerment if by pressing a nickel, they get to buy individual products from the New York Times and be done with the transaction. That's it. It's over. And I have the power to say I want that nickel back, but that was a nickel's worth of interesting. The point is humans are varied.
The one click has got to be critical to that.
That is absolutely, you talk about buyer's remorse. That is a small psychological factor compared to what is absolutely proved, and that is slowing down surfing. Clay Shirky says, nobody will ever pay for anything. That's completely disproved. People will pay. They don't want to be slowed down. And a nickel button.
And have to log in and have a sort of,
right.
Now my site's, we know it's going to be hacked. So I will.
And I have to find my password, or I have to decide.
Right.
So this may be indecorous, but I will raise it anyway. All other great technologies in the history of the internet are led first and foremost by the pornography industry.
Good point.
Mark, did you pull that off the question feed, or is this great minds think alike?
No, is that a question?
Yes.
Those Venus figures that prove that we were Gaia worshippers 25,000 years ago. Excuse me. What's the most obvious use?
Good point.
The point is that there you're talking about the divided personality of a person who uses the product and then wants to disavow it.
No, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's the question.
Quite the opposite. I mean, this is why the privacy piece becomes really important, right? So, someone who might not want to log into and be a member of a website, right, might be perfectly happy to do a one-click transaction. If in fact they were comfortable that transaction is somehow anonymous.
Building credibility that you can be trusted to obey the privacy preferences is going to be one of the major competitive factors in this company building trust.
The intermediary that's doing the money. So can I ask the question? Isn't that just Google? Or Facebook, right? So that is, I would love it to be something that breaks up our existing kind of tech monopolies, but why aren't the companies who are already collecting and generating the information the natural intermediaries to do this for us?
They might, if they had any sense to realize that this is a competitive with their advertising model, but could be handled internally. The human nature generally says, I'm not going to support something that would eat our own lunch. And that's what happened to Kodak, which invented the digital camera, for crying out loud. Sears, in probably the greatest piece of capitalist stupidity, in 1992, ended their Sears catalog. They had the greatest catalog system in the world, greatest fulfillment system and warehouses in the world. In the very year that Jeff Bezos was starting to fulfill book orders out of his apartment. So whether or not psychologically, and by the way, people can look up my Google talk that I gave just 3 weeks ago, in which I talked about some of these things. One topic we could talk about, if people want, in another of these is why Johnny can't code, and how Google and Apple and Microsoft could solve that almost overnight with 1 FTE employee each.
Just going one step back. We were just on the point of a really interesting set of issues that there's several questions coming in on, which is about interactions between this micropayment with disavowal system and other potential revenue streams. So a couple of people have asked, would content providers receiving this be expected at some point to reduce third-party ads on their sites? A couple of people have asked, wait a sec, as soon as this takes off, doesn't it mean that providers or producers of information who rely upon subscription models would see their revenue streams completely collapse?
Well,
any thoughts on those interactions?
Absolutely. It goes back to this thing might eat our own lunch. And yes, the New York Times would lose some subscribers who say, I'd rather pay a nickel each. The point is that at the beginning, it's found money because those groups are probably going to be separate, different populations. Over time, you have to be able to say, what's going to happen here? Is this silo going to give way to micropayments where people pay per article? I am not asserting that I know that the one eating the other would wind up being a net benefit. I am not an expert at that. I'm good at ideas and seeing perspectives and seeing things that may have been overlooked. And that's a comment. That's a comment. The point is, though, that it is highly plausible, in fact, obviously likely, that these would be in parallel for a good long time. And then if the silo model is being eaten, it's because it deserves to be. Now, will they break their promise that when you press the nickel button, the ads will be considerably muted and shrunk? Yes, Mark, obviously they will try over time.
So I'm not so sure about that. I wanted to go back to that anyway, and since it's been raised again, I don't think it's inevitable that we'll end up in cable territory, because what websites might do is they might actually have 2 buttons, and one button says 5 cents and the other says, no thanks, just track me, or something like that.
Or a dime and no ads.
Maybe, right, something like that. And so I'm actually kind of excited about this model as potentially not only giving people a choice, but educating them about their choices too. And if first movers do something like that, then I think that kind of will wind up it will make it hard for other content providers to do something different or without looking back.
I think that's a very important point, Jane. And look, I think that what's fundamental here is, none of us here are in a position to actually start a company to do this. But I think what becomes clear is one of the most important attractive features here is that the startup difficulty of creating this intermediary system without having to convincingly replicate PayPal's level of security ought to be, it certainly looks to me, and I am not a businessman, I've never been able to exploit my damn patents, and I should own all of augmented reality. But it certainly looks to me as if the entry barrier for creating such an experiment should be much lower than for any previous micropayment system, and should be one that content providers like the New York Times would say, you mean all we have to do is put this symbol, clickable symbol, at the bottom of our articles and money will come in? it sounds to me like it's something that at least some angel investor might be interested in trying on.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. But if I could also buttress, I think, one of the things that Jane was saying, we as consumers have a weapon we didn't really have for cable. Although in a sense we got at one point which was the fast forward. But we have ad blockers. And right now, the way this chess game perhaps works is I put on my ad blocker, usually blocks the ads, but some sites sense it and say, you need to, in order to access our stuff for free, let's say, you need to turn off the ad blocker. And I sometimes grudgingly say, okay, fine, because I can turn it off for this site. All right, so let's say that there is that I pay 5 cents. And then I have my ad blocker on. They say, no, you still have to turn off the ad blocker. My guess is that's going to cause a good deal of customer unhappiness because I paid the damn 5 cents. Give this to me without trying to milk me for more. Now, not all people will say that, but my guess is enough that the typical company is going to say, we'd like to try to exploit this, maybe by raising the amount to 10 cents, rather than saying once you've paid even this modest amount, now you can't see it unless you do something else extra.
I think the experiment...
You can deploy the... Yes.
Right. And there will be parameters that we don't know right now.
Right.
What we can say is that these parameters will be available to a company that tries this. For instance, a nickel button with small ads and a dime button with no ads. That's one approach. What's clear from this conversation is that parameters that can address these objections are available and can be tried. One more question, Ted?
We got a bunch of other good ones. Let me pick from...
Maybe we have time for one, maybe.
Yeah, we only
I'm
have
sorry,
time
Mark,
for...
do you have to go at 3 or?
Okay.
No, so we have time, a little bit more time then.
We advertised 1 hour. We can stretch
Sounds
a couple
good.
of minutes, but not more.
All right, good.
Okay, I'm going to give you 2 different questions to the group and let you choose. So one says, what about tip jar? It was seamless and it failed. Is it a relevant lesson for the applicability and scalability of this model? And then on completely different territory that becomes relevant based on the discussion a moment ago where the response to some questions was, well, make the sum a little bit bigger. If data tracking is dependent on the ability to pay, then doesn't this system imply that privacy becomes a privilege only for the wealthy? So
the latter, I've been talking about privacy for a very long time. And the fact is that privacy needs to be something that we personally can enforce. And we do that through transparency. And there's no time to really get into that. The tip jar relies upon people's superego being one that is motivated to some degree by guilt and obligation. Now that's fine. I'm all in favor of superegos and guilt and obligation. But there are much better uses for it than wearing it out 100 times a day with little sayings, can you give me a tip? Give me a little bit of tip. And the fact of the matter is this is a business transaction. And anybody who has internet access is going to be able to afford a nickel, 20, 50, 60 times in any given day. Even if it's a quarter, it's highly likely that the poor will not be inconvenienced. What we're talking about here is something where, nevertheless, this is an interesting question, whether or not there might be deluxe concierge services like Amazon just declared that there's a membership invitation only portion of Amazon. Geez, it's time for a revolution.
I'm sorry, Mark.
I was just going to say that's where all the PlayStation 5s went. They're being held for the invitation members.
I want to know what Jane has to say about this because I know she's thought a lot about data and privacy.
Well, I guess first, just generally, privacy, even if privacy becomes something that the wealthy can afford more of, that's already true, and it's probably also true of almost everything. So this, but I look at it kind of in reverse, that until we had the internet, we mostly had to pay for content. Even magazines, which were supported by ads, you still had to pay a little something. And it was the internet and its tracking that made a new business model that was made things more accessible. And so with that history in mind, yeah, we're reestablishing a privilege, but it's, you know, it's just harder to know whether there's some moral culpability with providing.
Oh, I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, so you're right. We paid for magazines, we paid for books, we paid for things that had a sort of marginal cost of redistribution. We didn't pay for radio. We didn't pay for television, right? And I think it's no accident that the advertising models developed there because they were solving a public goods problem.
Right.
It's actually really hard to exclude people from listening to your radio or your television. It's not impossible. There are countries, there are developed countries in the world where you have to pay a TV tax. And if you don't pay a TV tax and we think you have a TV, we send government agents around or private copyright owners around to see whether you're cheating. That just seems like a pretty inefficient way to do things.
Well,
Advertising.
It does get back though to the Splinternet thing, because television and radio was also when we started seeing segments split up so that the advertising could pitch to the appropriate audience. And
but not during the golden age of television, and that's why on my list of expansions of vision and knowledge and attention, it's in the 1950s and 60s that television was unifying, and McCarthy's victims and Martin Luther King and Gandhi, they all credit television with having saved them. And this reversed the usual thing that happens in new media. Usually the new media are devastating to a society first, and then people get better. In television's case, it was the opposite, about 25 years in which, and my cousin was Newton Minow, who said that TV was a vast wasteland. Well, maybe so, but it was a unifying wasteland. All of us, Jane, every time now and then you hear guys like Gene and me and Ted break out into some commercial jingle from the 60s. You're not missing out. But it's something that we share.
My only objection to that is that the golden age of television was from Buffy through Battlestar.
Well, that is indeed a topic for another conversation. And I have to say, you folks, you've just steered toward one fabulous area of questioning that I've actually not brought forward from the attendee questions, which is people proposing alternative revenue models. Basically, instead of micropayments with disavowal, a couple of people have said, what about something like the BBC? A couple of people have said, what about something like NPR, PBS, where there's a combination of funding from general tax revenues, you know, perhaps targeting.
And who decides to go? Who decides what is going to be on NPR and PBS and BBC?
Yeah, the thing is, what you're talking about is some degree of political consensus. I know those are science fiction sounding words.
Yeah.
Right.
Political consensus. Politics was this thing, you see, where grown-ups would disagree over maybe 50%, agree about the other 50%, and then negotiate on the parts that they disagreed about. You can read up about it, and we science fiction authors think that maybe politics might be restored after being deliberately sabotaged for the last 30 years. Having said all that, politics decides about some degree of subsidy for certain types of the creation of content in art museums, NPR, things that help to bring us together. But that has very little to do with micropayments. Micropayments is an attempt to create a market that responds better in an Adam Smithian sense. And as I said, Adam Smith today, I do not think would be with the political party that most mentions his name.
Can I just, because I do think the one response to the question, I mean, to me, right, what we want is a pluralistic vision of how content is created and how content is paid for. So I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, right? I think you can have a bunch of content, and you do on the internet, created for free just because people like to create, because it's now cheap to create, because they now have a channel, right? I mean, an enormous amount of stuff is generated that way. You do have voluntary support mechanisms that work, right? Lots of things are created through Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and so forth, because people want to support them, I think those things and NPR and micropayments can all coexist because they're serving different niches for the different markets.
And also the nickel button can be a tip button also. I mean, it smoothly transitions into a tip button. It just depends on whether or not you have to press it to read past the second paragraph of an article you want, or whether it starts flashing, you know, before the final little dance, TikTok dance they do.
Right, making Bambi eyes at you.
Well, that's right. You know, if you liked this article or this presentation, press a nickel to see my little thank you dance. There are so many. The thing is that this allows a fluidity of competitive implementations of micropayments with disavowal. And I would be disappointed if only one company were handling it. It would be a good thing if there were 3 or 4 that were, because I believe the barriers for entry to this would be fairly small. Fairly low bar. And then if there were 3 or 4 to choose from, then the preferences that I talked to Jane about would be part and parcel of the different experience that you'd have in different implementations of this micropayment system. But I think
I'm sorry, Ted,
on that point, we're 5 minutes over our scheduled time. We have a bunch of rich questions teed up. So I have to say, one of the questions that's come through is a comment. It says, next time you do this, make it 90 minutes. And that sounds exactly spot on to me. So I think it is time to bring this to a close now. There is one urgent outstanding question that I must pass on. And that is, Jane, what is the name of your dog?
His name is Arthur. He's 17 years old and is deaf and doesn't know what's going on or what time of day it is. So.
I'm sure he's very happy.
Okay.
Except with me at one point.
Well, who knows what a bark means?
It's true. I was being self-indulgent at that point. It's interesting that she chose that particular moment to bark a chide at me.
We are going to do this again. I mean, it's not again, but we are going to continue this discussion. And so one of the things I'd like to do is get to some of the questions that we didn't discuss as we dig deeper into what the system might look like, how we might avoid problems and that sort of thing.
And I think that could then segue into a discussion of anonymity and pseudonymity, which was another thing that we discussed.
Right. Yeah. I think it'd be very good.
There are great questions that are up from the panelists and from the attendees who've been sending them via the web link. But I think I do have to close it now. So any of you folks who have a 10-second or less urgent closing remark, please make it.
Well, I'm going to plug my comedy, The Ancient Ones. It will make you think that 2020 wasn't all stupid evil. This is highly stupid funny.
All right.
Okay. Eugene.
I just want to close with one thing that I think came out from what people were saying. There have long been lots of ways of funding things. There's been the king. There have been rich patrons. There were, in the late 1700s, subscriptions where you'd get money from a whole bunch of people, and then the person writes the book, and then there's a little thank you thing there. And then there's copyright, for example, which is also a means of trying to decentralize things without decisions by kind of rich and powerful decision makers about what to fund, although at very substantial cost. So one question is, what effect will that have on this very rich ecosystem, supplementary to it, probably for a long time won't replace it?
Great, to be continued. Jane and Mark, any urgent, brief closing remarks? Okay, then I'm going to say, you folks, you rock. What a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much for all of the wonderful speakers. Thank you to those participating and attending, particularly for the excellent questions that have been coming through. Thanks to the 2 sponsoring organizations, Arizona TechLaw and AI Pulse at UCLA Law School, aipulse.org. And it sounds like there is interest and enthusiasm to continue this conversation, and that sounds like a fabulous idea. So everybody, oh, and I forgot to say thank you doubly to Wei-Joan Uden and Laura Elbaum at UCLA Law, who handled the preparation and technical management of this. And Stay tuned for announcement of the next time. Thank you all so much.
And many thanks to you, Ted, for keeping us all on an even keel, to the extent such a thing was possible.
Okay, make it so. Bye-bye.